Last Rites. It was the day they were going to bury Paddy Pape. Will woke before dawn and packed his bags. Just 2 bags. Clothes and books. It was amazing how little he owned. He had almost nothing. Cobb, too, had little. He had left the house the day after they found Paddy. He only had a duffel bag over his shoulder. Will had dressed himself in a fine dark suit and silk tie. He had shaved and cut his hair with a pair of electric clippers he found in the bathroom. It was a business day. He had to be presentable. He looked out the little square window in his room. It was warm enough to open it and stick his head out, the way he had done when he had first taken the room. He was leaving shortly after the funeral. He was to take the truck up north. Cobb had bought some property in the woods. He wanted the truck left there. After that, Will had to settle the vision once and for all. It was coming upon a full year he had been in West Toronto. He walked downstairs and into the kitchen. He opened all the cupboards, pulled the refrigerator and stove out, and turned everything upside down to find a banana peel, an old banana-flavored air freshener, or any explanation for the smell of bananas that had been in the kitchen the whole time he had lived in the house, which, to his best guess, was very close to 12 months since the exact day he had moved in 1 year past. The banana smell required an answer, but he could find no explanation. He went over to the Dolphin for coffee. He took Cobb's small black bag with him. It was grey and damp outside. The rain had brought back the memory of his vision. His deepest reflections on the vision had been in the rain-soaked previous spring he had arrived from Ottawa. It had been so long since he had spoken to his sister. His family must miss him, he thought. He had been mourning Paddy Pape's passing for 3.5 days. He had been mourning as Cobb had instructed him to mourn. He woke every morning at dawn and walked to the front of the lake. He spoke to the lake, and he spoke to the trees, and he spoke to the sky. He spoke to the Creator. He offered the morning as a token for his vision's meaning, as Cobb had told him that the spirits had their economy too. They required our feeling. In the offering of that feeling, knowledge was sometimes given by the spirits, Cobb told him, and so Will fasted, and did as Cobb had instructed. It was Will's first appearance in the Dolphin in more than a week. Robert Polsky walked in and came down to his booth and sat down. Robert had been gone for some time. Only Cobb knew how to find him. Cobb was gone, Paddy was gone, Robert was back. Will ordered him breakfast. "That's a nice suit," Robert said. "Thanks, Robert. You look like an economist." Will sat stupefied in front of Robert. Somewhere in the seemingly random images that had played themselves out in his head a year past were the answers to how he came to be the heir to Paddy Pape's estate, guardian of the resurrected Robert Polsky, and partner to Randall Cobb Sr. His life had become the vision he couldn't define. Who were these people? Will said goodbye to Robert and left the Dolphin. He went home and sat in his chair in front of the attic window for some time, staring at the grey and desolate day. He held a police badge that had been waiting for him on the porch, along with a note from Fillmore, saying he could no longer hold on to it because Fatima had left Cobb. No funeral was arranged. They were going to burn Paddy. Those were his wishes. All that remained was a visit to the wake and a signature in the registry. And that was all the formality Paddy had left in the world. His name and person would affect no more, except in the minds of those called to remember him. Will put the badge in his suit jacket and left his room. Will went to the Royal Bank, where he was greeted by Mr. Willis. It was a solemn occasion, so greetings were terse. Mr. Willis put on a rain jacket and they walked out of the bank together. A light rain came down as nothing more than a weighted mist. It couldn't be felt, but after 6 blocks of walking, both Will and Mr. Willis were wet. On the way to the funeral house, they discussed 1109897 Ontario Inc.'s year-end reporting. Will had signed all the papers. He was legal guardian of the corporation. The net worth of 1109897 Ontario Inc. was in excess of $750,000. They arrived at the funeral home and walked into the foyer, where they were greeted almost immediately by a dour-looking man in a dark suit. "Paddy Pape," Will said. They were led to a dimly lit room in which Paddy Pape lay with cherubic poise in a wooden box. He was to be cremated later that day. The wake had been set up by Mr. Willis. It turned out that he had managed Paddy Pape's money for a little longer than 1109897 Ontario Inc.'s. Small world. Mr. Willis had received a letter days before Paddy killed himself. It instructed him on the funeral arrangements, and it instructed him to contact William Toad. It was odd for them to meet under such circumstances. Once the automatic withdrawals had stabilized, there was no need for them to communicate. As they both stood over the form of Paddy Pape, restored to some semblance of life and given once again whatever beauty he had in life, which, aside from his inner beauty, had never been much, they felt awkward. It was like a dream. Will and Mr. Willis standing before the corpse of Paddy Pape on the day of his wake, hands folded in front of them, saying nothing. The silence was loud. Funeral homes were built to accommodate silence, and silence was an accommodation in a city. There was no priest or minister to say a few words. There were no last rites. Paddy Pape was a free man. Will felt none of the comfort he had felt in his imagined and faceless death at Mass the past spring with Mrs. Duncan. This death had a face, and this death left him cold as stone. Will stepped forward and said, "This man I knew, Paddy Pape. He was a good man. He wanted to leave the world a better place than he found it. He never gave up on people, and he never stopped loving life. He dreamed of a better world, and like a jealous lover, the world that is took its revenge. He taught me that compassion comes from the passions." Will reached into his black bag and removed a purple carnation. He placed it atop Paddy Pape. Then he stepped back and bowed his head. After what he felt was a suitable time of reflection on the impromptu eulogy, Mr. Willis told Will that if the dispersals from the primary trust picked up again, it was quite possible for the company to make $1 million in its first year. He whispered in front of Paddy Pape's cadaver. Will explained in whispers that the quarters of good dispersal were the result of money released by litigation, and that the bulk of it had been given to Mr. Polsky. However, Will whispered, there was just recently another transfer from the primary trust. In fact, the biggest ever, $250,000, the result of an out-of-court settlement on a dispute within the primary trust beneficiaries. $250,000, Mr. Willis said. $250,000, Will said, and he handed the check which he had signed in the taxi on the way to the Royal Bank to Mr. Willis. Mr. Willis looked it over. "Who is Randall Seymour?" he asked. "He's a cousin of Mr. Polsky's." "Oh, I see," Mr. Willis said. Both Will and Mr. Willis signed the funeral home registry on the way out. They both noted with a slight discomfort that they were the only two people to have viewed Paddy Pape. There was no family and there were no other friends. After the wake, Mr. Willis went back to the bank and Will continued on with his busy day. They parted with some final rules for the governance of 1109897 Ontario Inc., as Will would be leaving Toronto for an undetermined amount of time, and he wanted to make sure that all questions were answered. Will walked home slowly after Paddy Pape's wake, even though there was still a drizzle. When he got home, he went up to the attic and got the notebook computer. He brought it down to the kitchen, connected to the internet, and checked his email. Cobb was in Costa Rica. His email said that he had surveyed the land. Some locals had wined and dined him, and they wanted him to invest in a big banana corporation, which they said they could get off the ground for $250,000. Will had told Cobb in his reply email to have the locals email an English prospectus, or some kind of formal business plan with risk and return projections. Otherwise, it was not possible. But they both agreed that banana farming might not be a bad business. After the email, Will went back upstairs. He lay down on his mattress in the attic and promptly fell asleep. Sometime later, there was a knock on the front door. He didn't hear Mrs. Duncan's footsteps. The knock sounded again, and then again, each time louder than the last. Who the hell would do that? He wondered. He got up, he got dressed, and he padded down the stairs. By the time he got to the door, the person was knocking loud enough to wake the dead. Will pulled open the door and looked at the man in a dark suit and tie, who had a thick mustache and who was holding a briefcase. He was a cop. Will knew it the moment he saw him. "What do you want?" Will asked. "Is Randall Seymour here?" "Who?" "Randall Seymour. Never heard of him." "Well, our records show that he lived here from November of last year." "What records? Who are you?" "My name is DaCosta, Frank DaCosta. I'm a detective sergeant with the RCMP. He reached into his jacket and removed his badge. Will had never seen an RCMP badge before. They were actually quite regal. "Well, what do you want?" "I'm trying to locate Randall Seymour. He's a convicted felon. His parole record indicates that he lives here, and we have no record of his whereabouts since his parole officer passed away, suddenly." "Well, like I said, I never heard of him. I do have a neighbor who was a parole officer. If there was a convicted felon in the neighborhood, I'm sure he would have let me know." "Paddy Pape never mentioned Randall Seymour to you?" "No, he did tell me about the pedophile 3 blocks over, but he never mentioned a Randall Seymour." "Sir, I must advise you that it would be in Randall's best interests to contact my office." "Look, buddy, you're the one who lost a convicted felon, not me. So don't give me any of your strong-arm shit, okay? I've got half a mind to call my city councillor and my member of provincial parliament and tell them the RCMP came to my door to warn me that there was a convicted felon lost in my neighborhood." "And how long did you say you've been missing this guy, Frank? A day? A week? Are you going door to door, Frank? How did you even end up at my door? What makes you think a person I've never heard of has been living in this house? Do you want to step in and look at the unclaimed mail? This is a rooming house, you know. There's always a record of people in a rooming house. Sir, if you lie to me, you could be charged with obstructing justice." "Oh, fuck you, asshole. What are you going to do, pepper spray me? You have no grounds for an arrest. Nor would you be in a position to secure an arrest at my home without a specific subsection on an arrest warrant, which you don't have. Not to mention the fact that you haven't made anything clear about what justice you're serving by your presence here today, let alone what justice you've observed obstructed. Or did you mean law when you said justice? That would make more sense. Only then we'd have to dispute interpretations of the law, because the law includes my rights, and chief among them is my right to knowledge, and more specifically, the justice you have defined and how I might aid in your pursuit of it, because you know I'm a citizen, and justice is important to me. A community can't function without justice. By the way, I'm curious, does that obstructing shit usually work in communities like this? I mean, how stupid do you count on people being to effectively do your job? Obstructing justice. You, sir, are one of the stupidest cunts I've met in some time. May I ask who you are, sir? If you want to keep breathing, you'll waste as little of my time as possible. Are you threatening me, sir? That's a matter of interpretation, and you don't have all the facts, and you've wasted enough of my time already. Now, unless you wish to proceed with an obstruction arrest, I'm closing my door. Good day, sir. I'll see you, Frank. Will watched Detective Sergeant DaCosta walk down the chipped concrete steps, cross the patched asphalt street, get into his big 4-door car, and drive away without so much as a glance back. Will went back upstairs and back to sleep. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep. It was still light outside the small square window in the attic. It was still gray, and it was still raining lightly. There was another knock at the door. He sat up on his mattress. He listened carefully. It wasn't the same knock. It was much lighter. He listened for the movements of Mrs. Duncan. She rarely answered the door. He decided that he wouldn't open the door. He lay down on his mattress. The knocking persisted. It stopped and started, stopped and started. And it was always the same light knock. It wasn't the Mountie. He didn't care who it was. He heard movement on the ground floor. Mrs. Duncan was up and about. If she answered the door and it was the Mountie, he was in trouble. He lay on his back and waited for the conclusion. He didn't care who it was. He didn't care what happened. He listened to Mrs. Duncan's slow footsteps make their way to the door. He heard voices. They were both female. He felt a deep relief. It could just be a door-to-door canvasser, Greenpeace or something like that. There was no need to worry. He closed his eyes and tried to nap some more, but it was not to be. He heard the slow steps of Mrs. Duncan ascending the stairs, something she had not done since Cobb moved into her large home. He sat up again on his mattress, propped on his palms, which were planted beside him. He listened carefully. He heard her voice. Mr. Tobe, she called from the second-floor landing. He got up and cracked his door an inch. Yes? Speak to the person at the door, please, she said. Okay, he said. He closed his door and went to the square window. He looked around for the Mounties car. He couldn't see it. He heard Mrs. Duncan walk back down the stairs and into her parlor. He opened his door and went down the 3 flights of stairs. The door was closed. Whoever was on the other side hadn't been invited into the house. He took a deep breath and opened the door. It was a woman. She looked to be in her early 20s, very rough around the edges. She had a lot of makeup on. I'm looking for Cobb, she said. Who are you? Will asked. Sheila. Me and him lived in the Gladstone. Cobb's gone. He said he was going to leave an envelope for me. There's no envelope, Will said. Is he going to mail it? I don't know. I need that envelope. I can't help you, Sheila. I need that envelope. I can't help you. Maybe he mailed it. If he did, it wouldn't be mailed here. Where would he mail it? Just a second, Will said. I'll get my jacket. Will put on his suit jacket, and he and Sheila walked the 10 blocks to the property where 1109897 Ontario Inc. received its mail. Cobb thought it was better to receive mail somewhere you didn't live. Will walked up the front steps with Sheila in tow and knocked on the door. PC Richard Chase opened the door and froze when he saw Sheila, beside a clean-cut young man in a suit and tie. Discretion was a big part of her business as a prostitute, so she let him off the hook and just looked at the ground. Yes, he said. Oh, hello. I'm wondering if there's any mail for a 1109897 Ontario Inc. You are? Chase asked. A friend of the director's. He asked me to pick up his mail. I can't give you the mail, kid, Chase said. It's from an insurance company. It might be a benefits check. Look, sir, my friend asked me to get his mail, that's all. There was no mention of the legality of it. Where's your friend? Latin America. I see, Chase said, and he placed a hand under his chin and lowered his head to think. Just give him the fucking mail, pencil dick, Sheila said. Percy heard the conversation from the living room, where she was rocking the baby. Her memory placed the voice. It was William Tobe. The baby was asleep. She walked briskly to the front door to see whether or not her ears were playing tricks on her, and no, she hadn't been tricked. It was William Tobe. She peeked out from behind Dick. He didn't move easily. It was like trying to push a big dog out of the way. His whole body was as tight as wood, and his face was red and puffy. She squeezed past him, smiled, and said, Hello, Will. Percy? Will said. Yes, how are you? I'm fine. What are you doing here? I'm moving in. You live here? Yes, why? I'm a partner in the property management company that owns this building. You're kidding. No, I had a little money and I invested it with a couple of friends. We picked it up with a small down payment. It's self-sufficient. Who's Mr. Willis? She asked. Oh, he works for me, Will said. Good for you, she said. How many buildings do you own? Chase asked. 9. Are you buying any more? No. Why not? It's a black cat market right now. Buyer beware. Now's not a good time to buy. I see, Chase said, and he squeezed Percy's arm affectionately, gave her the letters, and left the vestibule to go back and check on the baby. Percy handed Will the letters Chase had left with her. She looked at Sheila and she looked at Will. Oh, this is Sheila, Will said. Nice to meet you, Percy said, and the 2 women shook hands. Well, as long as you're here, do you want to see the baby? Percy asked. I'd love to, Will said. Percy led Will and Sheila into the living room and beamed above the newborn in the rocker. It was the oddest thing. Will thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The baby looked exactly like Cobb. Will reached over and hugged her. Chase felt the hair on the back of his neck go up. He stepped towards them, and the sound of his step told Will to let go of her. They looked at each other. I have to go, Will said. Thanks for the mail. He and Sheila walked to the vestibule with the mail. Sheila slipped into her heels in a half-second and bolted outside. The door closed behind her. Will stooped and slipped into his loafers, and he heard Dick and Percy in the living room. There's no way that guy owns this property, Chase said. I just gave him the letters because I believe he knows the other guy and because I wanted to avoid a confrontation. That guy was in a parking lot 6 blocks over last summer. Someone called it in. He was wandering around talking to himself and breaking bottles at midnight. He lives in a home. Real whack job. Jesus talk and everything. I remember that guy. It was just before I was assaulted. And that broad with him? Yeah, she's a crack whore. She's been busted 3 times. Well, that would explain why he never let me pick him up at his house, Percy said. I knew he was under a lot of stress, but I had no idea he was that unbalanced. She stood silent for a moment and said, It's so sad the way things turn out sometimes. There's just so much sadness in the world. Will slipped out of the house quietly and let the door glide shut. Sheila was waiting for him on the sidewalk. Cars were slowing down as they passed her. They went through the mail as they walked. There was nothing for her. She wouldn't leave Will without some kind of payment after learning he was Cobb's partner. He went to an ATM and got her $500. She wanted to suck his cock, but he told her he didn't want it. The last thing she said to him before they parted, as she was counting the money in an alley, was, Am I high, or did that fucking kid look just like Cobb? On his way back to Mrs. Duncan's rooming house, his last night there, he dropped the police badge of PC Richard Chase into a mailbox. It would crawl like a spider across the vast web of the Queen's bureaucracy until it found the place it came from. End of chapter.